Okay, so the first thing I think I should actually say, I just noticed while I was sitting here looking at this image that you've all been looking at, this shows Persepolis, this is figures on the Apadana here, and then this is the Parthenon frieze. And the way I've set it up seems to imply that we're kind of moving from a kind of darkness in Achaemenid Persia into Greek enlightenment in some sort of lovely future. That is completely unintentional. This is just because I can't do colour balance. It's not even an accurate reflection of the stone. The Akropolis is marble and Persepolis is limestone, so there's a little bit of difference between it. But yeah, it's just Photoshop. Also, I noticed, actually Ben pointed out to me that I've put men for the Persepolis picture and women for the Akropolis one. There's slightly more justification for this, actually, as although the Akropolis, may not be the most feminist of monuments in the world, there is literally only one female figure at Persepolis, which is the lioness being brought as tribute by the Elamite delegation. So it's very, very, very lacking in women. Anyway, that's not really relevant to my talk. That was just a little point I felt I should clarify before we get any further. Right. Today we're talking about Persepolis and the Akropolis, and about decorative art and its relationship to politics. The Akropolis is doubtless familiar to all of you. Obviously the Athenian Akropolis, as we see here. And the time period I'm talking about is the 5th century and the Persepolis building program, for reasons that will become apparent as we go through the material. Persepolis, which many of you are also probably aware of, is one of the capitals of Achaemenid Persia at the same time. I've just drawn a little map here. So we have Athens over in Greece, and Persepolis is here in what is now modern-day Iran. It's just north of Shiraz. It's in the middle of the Markadesh plain. Persepolis sometimes had a rather odd status with classicists, particularly because it's not actually mentioned in any of the classical sources until Alexander's historians. And also because, as we'll see, it has an absolutely huge amount of sculpture on it, far more than any of the other Persepolitan sites. It's sometimes been argued that it's a kind of ritual site used for the celebration of Persian New Year, nowadays called Nowruz, and that in some way it's kind of hidden away and it's secret and uninhabited. To be honest, increasingly, there really doesn't seem to be any reason for this. It seems to sort of function very similarly to palaces at Susa and Ecbatana. It's a little bit further to the east, so it's possibly a reason why the Greeks didn't mention it, or it could just be a text, an omission in the sources. That's not by any means impossible. Anyway, just back to nice images again. Generally, it seems that Persepolis consisted of audience halls and palaces. Whether or not they're inhabited is still slightly debated. There seemed to be this more and more excavation taking place in the plains, which is coming the plain directly below Persepolis, just here, which may be the actual sort of inhabited buildings, and then the platform itself could sort of be for more bureaucratic and ceremonial purposes, we don't know. The Persians themselves called Persepolis Parsa. That's the name that they use in the inscriptions. Again, it's not quite clear when they say that whether they mean just the high terrace platform here, or whether they mean the various buildings that were in the plain below. I should probably just mention, you can't actually really see it in this aerial photograph, but Persepolis is on a very high platform. It's not quite as high as the Akropolis, but it's extremely significant. But regardless of that, the basic point to make there is that Persepolis and the Akropolis are very, very similar in being these high monumental sites set above some kind of city or conglomeration or something of that ilk below them. Building work at Persepolis started in the reign of Darius I, the Achaemenid king, so this is sort of towards the end of the 6th century. Darius was consolidating his hold over the Achaemenid Empire, which had been established by Cyrus in the mid-6th century, established extremely quickly. It stretched by this point from the Indus all the way to the Nile. And Darius's hold on the empire was a little bit dubious because he was a usurper of sorts and had had to put down a number of rebellions at the start of his reign. On a trilingual inscription in the south wall of Persepolis Terrace, he wrote, "I am Darius, the great king, king of kings, king of countries, king on this wide earth, son of Hystaspes, the Achaemenids. By the favour of Ahura Mazda is the Persian god, this fortress, it was I who built it as Ahura Mazda, all the gods being with him wished it, namely that this fortress be built. And I built it, completed it, beautified it, and made it solid, exactly as I determined." 50 years later, in Athens, obviously we're on the very, very fringes of this huge Persian Empire, we find the Heraclean building program taking place. In this case, it's initiated by the Athenian demos, rather than by the king, because obviously there isn't one. And again, they're consolidating their hegemony over their newly established archaea. Whether we want to think of it as an empire or not is something we can debate. And as a result of this, they start building the Akropolis. Despite the sort of Greek love of epigraphy and inscriptions, there isn't really an equivalent foundation text for the Akropolis. And in fact, a sort of very interesting subject, which I'm not going to talk about today, is the different ways in which texts and inscriptions are used on the two sites. They're completely different, much more religious, arguably, of Persepolis. Oddly, given that it's the Akropolis. Anyway, what we do have is Thucydides' famous comments in the histories, where he compares Athens and Sparta, and he notes, if Athens were become deserted, and only the temples and foundations of the buildings remained, one would conjecture from what met the eye that the city had been twice as powerful as it in fact is. And the point about these quotes is that in their different ways, they show a clear connection between these sites and political power. And the Thucydides quote in particular expresses various concepts which are now very important in archaeological thinking about monumental architecture. It's very close to what Elizabeth de Marais calls the materialization of power, and it even has sort of certain similarities with someone like Pierre Bourdieu's ideas of cultural capital invested in these monumental buildings. The Persepolis inscription is less discursive, as is of course typical of Achaemenid written sources, but it also advertises the very close connection between the king and the site. And this idea of the king as builder, as that being one of his important roles, is very common in the Achaemenid world generally, and indeed it's a trope that's common in a lot of the Near East, although we want to be careful about distinguishing between Persepolis and other Near Eastern sites, but it's found in other places. Okay, however, what neither of these quotes really includes is a more detailed discussion of how exactly these sites have political effects. In particular, as we will see, although there are some strong similarities between Persepolis and the Akropolis, some of which I've touched on already, there are also some pretty major differences, particularly in how they deploy architecture and sculpture on the two sites. So what I'm trying to consider here is the possibility that these differences in the material are designed to have not just political effects generally, but very particular political effects. There's a lot said in archaeological thoughts about how monumental sites create effects of power. This is mainly sort of fairly obvious stuff. They're very visible, they're very permanent. There's a kind of basic human tendency to read large architecture as signifying sort of something important. Also, an interesting point Mukherjee makes that they tend to show a great expenditure of resources and labour. So in a very kind of literal way, they show the sort of the power that whoever managed to build them had. But what we're trying to do here is really to go beyond that, not just look at power, but not just look at them as manifestations of power, but as designed to create a very particular social reality. So the aspect of that we're talking about today is decoration. In my PhD, I looked at various different aspects of the sites. Decoration was just one of them, but that's what I decided to talk about today because we had to narrow it down. But before we start talking about that, there's another sort of essential question, which is why compare Persepolis and the Akropolis at all? As Kathy said, a lot of work on the two sites tends to look at influence from one to the other, whereas what I've been concerned with is trying to do a much more directly, purely comparative, theoretical approach. So I just wish to talk about the relationship between them in the literature and what it really means to do just a comparative approach. Basically, the connection between these two sites goes right back to the classical period. As you're probably aware, Alexander the Great burnt Persepolis, and this is generally seen as revenge for the Persian sack of the Akropolis in 480. This idea goes back to the classical sources. Persepolis is actually first mentioned in the Greek sources in this particular context. He's mentioned, well, we don't have Clearchus, who doesn't survive, but he's mentioned by Diodorus, who is almost certainly drawing on him. In Diodorus 1720 to 22, he describes Persepolis as the wealthiest city under the sun. And then he recounts how one of the courtesans in Alexander's retinue incited the burning of Persepolis to punish the crimes committed against the Greek sanctuaries. Whether or not this particular account of how Persepolis burned is true doesn't need to concern us here. The evidence actually is mainly that that's not the case. They studied the scorch marks, and it seems much more likely that it's extremely deliberately set arson rather than being any kind of accident. Anyway, the important thing here is that the relationship between these two sites is seen as involving revenge for the burning of the Akropolis. In more modern academic scholarship, Persepolis and the Akropolis are first directly compared in 1951 in an article by A.W. Lawrence in the Journal of Hellenic Studies, rather imaginatively entitled The Akropolis and Persepolis. Here we have A.W. Lawrence, is the little boy in the middle here. He is, of course, one of the younger brothers of T. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, who we see sitting over here. He was an extremely successful classical archaeologist. He became Lawrence Professor at Cambridge. It's not the same Lawrence, it's not even spelled the same. That was just confusing. And he was also a student here at the British School in the mid-1920s. He was the model for this astonishing statue entitled Youth. This is in the Scott Polo Institute in Cambridge. And it was done by Kathleen Scott, who was the widow of Scott of the Antarctic. This is not actually remotely relevant to my talk, but I just thought it was rather wonderful, so I thought I should share that with you. Okay, so more seriously, Lawrence's article is very, very interesting. It covers nearly all of the approaches that people have taken to Persepolis over the subsequent decades, including actually the approach that I use myself pretty much. He starts off by suggesting there's a link between politics and architecture in Greece and Persia, just as I'm trying to. And he says that by comparing Persepolis and Akropolis, it should be possible to learn something about Greek and Persian society. What he says precisely is, two of the greatest monuments of the ancient world date from the 5th century BC, and they embody respectively the ideals of the Persian and of the Athenian Empire. A comparison between the two schemes must reflect the divergence between the Persian and the Greek outlook, but also reveals some elements in common, if only because of inevitable resemblance in ways of thinking among contemporaries when confronted with rather similar problems. So he's kind of setting up a sort of sociological comparison between the architecture of the two sites. Unfortunately, he doesn't actually develop this idea at all. It's quite an odd article in this way. He talks about it at the beginning, and then just at the very, very end, he comes back, and the conclusion that he draws is that the Athenians show superiority in artistry and society, which is a bit disappointing and very typical, of course, of the period he's writing in. So what does he actually spend the article talking about? Well, firstly, he talks a lot about the possibility that similarities between the sculpture on the two sites are due to direct Greek work at Persepolis. This is a very common idea at this period. It was actually suggested right back in the 19th century. The idea's been around for ages. And in fact, very early visitors to the site, you can see them all interpreting Persepolis, this is even pre-19th century, in terms of Greek temples, at least the sort of highly educated classical ones are all doing that. But anyway, this idea really comes into ascendancy in 1946, when Henry Frankfurt and Gustav Richter simultaneously publish in the American Journal of Archaeology articles discussing the sort of Greek influence at Persepolis. And their basic approach is to point out stylistic similarities between the two sites. This is quoting Richter, above all, the delicacy of the work and the lightness of touch in many of the Hymenian products are typically Greek. Notice that great normativity going on there as well about how good Greek sculpture necessarily is compared to Persian. Apart from this, what they generally do is they look at very, very close details that they say are the same on the two sites. For instance, they'll look at the ways in which the corners of the eyes are drawn on the various figures, or a particular favourite is looking at the sort of swallowtail folds in the garments and comparing the Persepolis robes to archaic Greek, which is not entirely plausible, as we will see. And this, of course, is in the tradition of Morelli originally and Beazley, the tradition of connoisseurship, that by looking at very, very close details, you can directly prove, ideally, this actual same artist's hand, or at least a sort of cultural similarity between two different objects. However, interestingly, as well as these details, both of them quote as one of their sources of inspiration for seeing Greek influence at Persepolis, Darius's building inscription, which was found in Susa. This was actually found in 1929, but it was very, very slow to come into sort of general knowledge, general usage, as both Frankfurt and Rick actually comment on this fact. What this inscription is basically, it's another proclamation by Darius, like the one we heard at the beginning, but this is about all the different people from all over his empire who he brought together in order to build Caesar. And one of these is the stonecutters who wrought the stone. Those were Ionians and Sardians. There's considerable debate still about whether this inscription should be taken at face value and whether there really is input from all over the empire in a building, or whether it's sort of an idealistic view of the whole empire coming together happily to engage in these building programs. But it's certainly, we can see it's a factor in this idea that Persian buildings, Persian art was based only influenced by Greece. This approach, that of sort of seeing Greek influence in Persia, is still fairly common, and actually is fairly plausible at a kind of low level. Nylander in particular talks about this with reference to stoneworking. He says that at Persepolis you can find this sort of whole set of techniques, I wrote down what they were, basically of how to cut the stone to build walls, which if you look in Lydia and Ionia, you can see them gradually developing over a period of time, whereas they're suddenly all being used together simultaneously at Persepolis. Which seems, that seems relatively plausible as an argument. There's other sort of independent evidence for the Greeks being present at Persepolis. There are some graffiti sketches which seem to be Greek and classical, and an inscription in 6th century Ionian scripts in one of the quarries. So the idea that the Greeks were in some way involved with Persepolis isn't actually totally implausible. But simultaneously, the publication of the Persepolis treasury tablets, which say they describe the work groups and who's being paid for work at Persepolis, they suggest that there were Greeks there, but they also suggest that they were not in high positions, that they were probably sort of running work groups or working, they may well have been sculptors, but they were not probably involved in the actual design of the buildings. And simultaneously, Margaret Root published in 1979 a book called The King and Kingship in Achaemenid Art, which was very interested in showing how Persepolis has its own very idiosyncratic iconography that it draws on the Near East and even possibly on Greece, but is really very much its own thing. So, chances are basically the Greeks may well have been at Persepolis, but they probably weren't major players in deciding the way that it looks. Lawrence also suggests influence from Persepolis to the Akropolis. This is much, much more controversial. He says, various anomalous aspects of the Akropolis, particularly its asymmetrical arrangement of buildings, the ground level reliefs of the Athena-Nika parapets, and the illustration of a contemporary subject on the Parthenon frieze, if we believe this to be the case, may have been influenced by Persepolis. The reason this is so controversial is not actually so much Lawrence's article, but that the same view is put forward by, again, Margaret Root in 1985 in an article entitled The Parthenon Frieze and the Apopadana Reliefs at Persepolis, Reassessing a Programmatic Relationship. Her argument has strong similarities with Lawrence's, however, it is somewhat different. Firstly, it's just talking about the Parthenon Frieze and the Apopadana, so it's cherry-picking these two buildings. from the sites rather than looking at the whole of them. But also, sort of more importantly, whereas Lawrence is arguing that the Athenians were sort of competing against Persepolis and trying to build something better, she is seeing it as sort of emulative, and she's trying to deconstruct any kind of opposition between Greece and Persia by saying that the Athenians, in their new sort of imperial role, were interested in having a capital that looked very like Persepolis. So this argument is obviously highly intriguing. Margaret Reed is absolutely fascinating scholar, so you should never dismiss anything that she says. But it's also somewhat problematic. The first problem that was brought up by David Castriota, and I think absolutely rightly, is that although there isn't anything in sort of Greek architectural sculpture that is exactly exactly a model of the Parthenon frieze, there are a number of things which sort of reasonably approximate to the kind of things that it's doing. He talks about the Siphaean treasury, he talks about building G at Xanthos, and he talks about the Kybele shrine, which is a stone model of a temple found in Sardis, which has a building with walls covered with continuous friezes. So he very much sort of dissolves that issue that there's anything kind of drivingly anomalous or weird about the Parthenon frieze. Another obvious question here is whether the Parthenon frieze really represents the Panathenaic procession. If it doesn't, then that is sort of instantly dissolved as well. And, well, anyway, that's a slightly separate question. And the other problem really is that if you look at Roots, the things that she argues are the same about them, they just seem, they're just not very pressing. This is just a list of the similarities between them. Two-pronged convergence towards a central scene, interplay of real and non-real spatial definition. Imminent convergence upwards, hand over wrist gesture. This is a particular gesture like that, which we see frequently in the friezes. Emphatic use of verticals to provide a transition in mood. And some thematic similarities, idealized order, and harmonious, hierarchically defined relationships within a society. All of these are quite interesting, but they also seem, to me anyway, to be rather nebulous. And the only one that is sort of really strikingly pressing is the presence of the hand over wrist gesture, but this is found, as Reed herself actually says, in a lot of the Near East, so that makes it slightly less immediately necessary to find an answer. So this again sort of makes it a slightly weakened argument, and the final point is the comparison with the Odeon. This is a reconstruction of this building at the foot of the Akropolis. And the point here is that the Odeon was another building which showed definite signs of Persian influence. As you can see, it has this very unusual, this is a hypostyle hall with pillars across it. And so this may well have been influenced by the Persians, but the point about this is that the Athenians thought about this as a peculiar building. And Margaret Miller actually quotes the comic poet Cretinos comparing the roof of the Odeon to Pericles' famously pointy head. The quote is, "Here comes the squirrel-headed Zeus, Pericles, wearing the Odeon on his head, now that the Ostracon is past." There are various possible models for this as well as Persian models. The Kosarian Atlases is an obvious example of a Greek hypostyle hall. But the basic point of making this comparison is that if the Athenians were going to build a sort of Persianizing building, they would probably build something as weird as the Odeon, something that was what Margaret Miller calls sort of mock Greek or mock Persian or Persian to Greek eyes. And this is a very different sort of claim to Margaret Reed's claim that Persian influence is being incorporated in a very, very straightforward fashion into this sort of hyper-classical building that is the Parthenon. Okay, so basically what we see from this is that there may be some kind of low-level influence from Greece to Persia, but it's not particularly problematic. And that the argument in the other direction is sort of relatively unlikely. So, if this is the case, we're left with what is the point of comparing these two sites? This can be sort of broken down into what is the point of comparative study generally, which is a fairly legitimate point, and particularly what is the point of comparing Persepolis and the Akropolis? And that's particularly pressing because actually attempts to understand Persepolis have been sort of continually actually troubled by attempts to understand it in terms of other cultures. Not just Greece, which we've kind of discussed already, but actually understanding Persepolis in terms of the Near East creates a certain number of problems. It's generally, basically because it's always denigrated as being insufficiently like the sculpture that it's being compared to, which in a sense isn't surprising because it's not trying to, but that's often how it's understood. So, how can we usefully compare the two sites? The short answer to this is hypothesis testing, which is what comparatists like to call it. Basically, the point is that interpretive archaeology, as I'm sure we're all aware, is extremely problematic because it's so subjective. How do you come up with an interpretation of what's going on a site? How do you justify your interpretation of what does something mean? And comparison is very useful as a way of attempting to do this. It's kind of a way of getting a fix on whether your interpretation of the particular site is in any way justifiable. If you can show that the same thing is happening on two different sites for two parallel reasons, that's obviously much stronger than just saying, I feel this is what's going on this particular site. So the idea with Persepolis and the Akropolis is that each sort of contextualizes the other and provides a contrast which illuminates whatever's unique about one and tests any explanation by demanding that it can be explained in both terms. Persepolis and the Akropolis are particularly good controls for each other. Their contemporary dates, geographical proximity, and broadly shared cultural heritage, and their continued cultural interaction within the sort of Eastern Mediterranean Near East mix during their existence fulfills the experimental condition of all other things being equal, which is very much beloved of comparativists. And it diminishes the typical comparative problem of finding legitimate shared terms in which to discuss different cultures. There are possible pitfalls with comparativism, which I have encountered in the course of my PhD. I won't go into that right now, but I look forward to your opinions as to whether it actually is a fruitful approach later on. Right, okay, so we've been talking a lot about background and theory, so let's get cracking on to the actual material on the sites. So, first of all, both Akropolis and Persepolis are absolutely covered in figures, mainly human figures, not all. We can see there's a monster over here, well, a huge monster, not at all. This is the Apodauna frieze, of which you've heard so much. This is one of the doorways in the Takara, the Palace of Darius, and this is the staircase in the Palace of Xerxes. These are just examples, so I won't say much about them, but just note that doorways and the staircases are two places that the Persians love to put sculpture. It's absolutely the most common of possible places. Meanwhile, here we have some Akropolis sculpture. This obviously is reconstructed, I'm sure you're all aware, but it's not there anymore, hopefully. This is Temple of Athena. We can see the sculpture all the way around it. And this is from the Akropolis Museum. These are bits of the Erechtheion frieze, which obviously doesn't survive intact because it's a very new technique of trying to pin stone onto background stone, and it turns out that that isn't a very effective way of making long-lasting friezes. And you'll notice here that unlike Persepolis, the sculpture is all sort of around the tops of buildings, binding them together. It's very much not. I mean, of course, there's sort of some relationship between doorways and that it's above the entrance to the Parthenon, but it's a very, very different choice of place to put sculpture. The sculpture on both these sites obviously has sort of iconographic meaning, and it's often been studied in those terms. Which is not unimportant, and there are things to be said about that comparatively. What I'm going to do right now is just look at them as decorative sculpture, as architectural decoration. By this, I mean two things. This is just to illustrate what we mean by decorative art. Firstly, decorative art sort of complements something, some particular objects. We can see here in this right arm that happening very clearly. And secondly, it tends to involve some form of pattern. So as you can see in the other example, you can see all the little king figures progressing around the bowl in one direction and then the birds going back in the other, creating a nice sort of pattern between them. These are both from the Oxus treasure in the British Museum, and so although their provenance is a little bit dubious, they are probably a chimonid. Okay. Decorative schemes are ubiquitous in all sorts of cultures, and their attraction has been grounded in accounts of visual perception, in particular in Gestalt theory. Gestalt theory holds that rather than just passively absorbing visual stimulus, the mind scans and filters visual information according to pre-existing principles. In particular, rather than it just scans, it doesn't take in all the information simultaneously, but it scans and looks for any kind of difference in the information that's getting to the world and then fixes on that instantly. So it moves easily over any kind of repetition and then sort of instantly hooks into any kind of deviation or unexpected break in that repetition. And basically the idea is that this is useful to humans because it's a way of getting the maximum possible information out of the environment. Obviously, if you took in all possible visual information all the time, you'd be completely overwhelmed, whereas this alerts you to anything sort of unexpected, anything changing that you need to know. The relation of this to decorative art is particularly discussed by Gombrich in the sense of order. And his basic argument is that decorative art is exploiting this tendency and that this is why decorative art is so popular. And it sets up a sort of contrast between the continuity and then the sudden attention-catching quality of variation within decorative objects. This can either be pleasant, as we see, I'm sure you've all had the experience of staring at something like a Persian rug and enjoying the sort of patterns and the way they sort of come and go, which Gombrich refers to as restlessness and repose. The sort of tension between them is supposed to be satisfying to the mind. But they can also be quite visually disturbing. This is a piece of op art, which is sort of, and how this works is it kind of sort of systematically overloads your visual perception and therefore becomes, it's very compelling, but it's also extremely sort of visually uncomfortable to look at. And the real point about this is something that we respond to on a very kind of innate level. You don't have to think about anything, you don't have to have any kind of cultural knowledge to be aware that that is sort of doing something significant to your eyes. Decoration is often also thought to have additional... should we get back to this one? I think maybe that's better. Let's do that. Decoration is also often thought to have social effects. This is particularly discussed by the anthropologist Alfred Gell. And he argues that this perpetually sort of shifting of attention and the inability to ever quite manage to pin down a pattern while simultaneously always being attracted to it and trying to resolve it, basically sort of prolongs interaction with that pattern and with whatever object that it's decorating. He calls this a mind hook, and the idea is that this is a way that sort of attaches people to objects or places. So how a pattern is functioning on your favourite cup or on a building is the kind of, it creates a sort of meshing process of engagement with it, which leads you to be attached to the object or to that site. And this bond is created between the viewer and the object itself, but it also, according to Gell, entails a certain sort of commitment to the social projects in which that object is involved. Or that building, obviously. Gell also notes that decorative schemes are very commonly found in apotropaic contexts, so trying to ward things off. They function as devices often in actual warfare. It's very common to find them on shields. And also in places that are held to be in need of protection. And he says that this is not actually as much of a paradox as you might think, and that you can use the same techniques both to attract and to repel. And the difference here is the sort of contextual perception of how they're directed. It's the same, the sort of adhesive quality, which in a sort of socially familiar situation causes you to be attached to something. In an apotropaic situation, it causes them to become stuck to the objects, and therefore they're dazzled by the design, and that kind of reduces your enemies or the demon or whatever it is you're concerned about's power and makes them harmless. He actually refers to apotropaic patterns as demon flypaper, and a rather nice turn of phrase. Okay, so how does this work on the sites? It's most obvious at Persepolis, so I will talk about that first. At Persepolis, there is completely overwhelming replication of themes, motifs, and details absolutely everywhere, both within individual compositions and from building to building. Practically every single figure appears at Persepolis multiple times. This is in very, very diverse places. This is completely common. The two favourite kinds of repetition are linear replication and symmetry. As we can see here, these different figures, one after another, and then the symmetry down the middle. Just pause to note, these are the swallowtail folds that I was telling you about earlier, which look slightly like archaic Greek art, and they do look like archaic Greek art, there's no denying that. So here we're just looking at two rows of figures, but they're actually 5 all stacked on top of each other. On one side of the doorway, this is in the 100-column hall. And not only are they on that side of the doorway, but they're actually on the other side as well. And this doorway then appears twice within this wall of the 100-column hall. So as we can see, there's this kind of astonishing level of repetition of particular figures across the site. And that's by no means unusual. We can see, as I said, doorways are one place where we find a lot of sculpture. The other is staircases. This is the tripylon staircase. And as you can see, again, there's a sort of repetition of the figures up the staircase following one after another. And this will then be reflected on the other side of the staircase so that the figures are moving on both sides of you as you go up it. This is just an example of it actually in context. This isn't the tripylon, this is the Palace of Xerxes, but the staircases with figures moving up the inside of them is very common. Right, so sometimes these figures have this very, very exact repetition as we see on the Apadana, and sometimes, this is also the Apadana actually, there's much, much more variation. So these are sort of normally interpreted as guards, and these are tribute bearers with much more variation amongst them. However, the really interesting thing about this variation is how it's done. This is a sketch drawn by Michael Rofe. Again, figures from the Apadana frieze, and the Apadana is so large that it has all sorts of figures at various different points on it. And what he notes about it is that the way in which the replication is created is by sort of differing combinations of a very, very small number of characteristics. The most obvious one that you can see is this variation between the swallowtail folds and these sort of flatter dresses and the sort of headdresses that go with them. But there are a number of different attributes and gestures taking place between these different characters. So they're holding flowers, or they're turning back, they have a sword, they're carrying a bow case. So between them, any individual figures actually tends to be very dissimilar from the ones next to it. But in total, Rofe says there are only actually 11 possible variables within the figures. Rofe describes the figures as combined as if from a sample book. And he notes that it uses a sort of combination of a sort of appearance of extreme regularity, but underlying it there is a genuine sense of disorder. He did very, very close analysis of these figures, and he found that there is actually no logical pattern underlying which figure will have which combination of characteristics. So when you look at them, you get this kind of feeling that there is a pattern going on there, and that you ought to be able to resolve it in some kind of way. But ultimately, if you try to do this, it's immensely frustrating because there isn't actually an underlying pattern. It is genuinely purely chance, or purely designed by the artist in a random kind of way. So I think we'll look at this as you look at the time. This is just about how the reputation kind of creates different textures depending on how it's done. So basically, the point about Persepolis is that there's kind of overwhelming effects of rigorous and compelling order and repetition from sculpture to sculpture and from door to door. For instance, I mean, you can see that most clearly on these actually repeating figures here. But the variation woven into the regularity and between it in different compositions creates a sort of Gallian mind hook which prolongs interaction. But at the same time, it creates a sort of sense of frustration in that you can't find the order that you're looking at. So you're getting simultaneously a kind of systematic overloading of your visual faculties from all of these figures everywhere that you can't make sense of and that you can't organise into the order that you feel you should be able to. And another interesting thing about this is the way that Persepolis, there's never a position where you can get an angle on the buildings. You can never see all of the building at a time. You can only see a bit of it. So any attempt to kind of find how they fit together and how the pattern works between them is extremely frustrated. This sort of sense of repetition at Persepolis has been commented on many, many times. Lord Kurtzon, at the beginning of a very unenthusiastic description of Persepolis right back in the 19th century, just said, it is all the same and the same again and yet again. Robert Barron, also visiting in the 1930s, was not particularly impressed. He said, the new staircase is really wonderful. Of course, it isn't great art. No art that makes you wonder all the time how much it costs can be that. Robert Barron's failure to understand Persepolis is one of life's great mysteries because he is obviously so artistically talented and such a pioneer in being interested in Islamic art, which is all about pattern and all about sort of Middle Eastern light and how that plays off on the surfaces of buildings. It is a complete mystery to me why he's so pleased about Persepolis. Possibly he was shown around by Herzfeld, so it's possible he didn't get on, I don't know. Anyway, Michael Rofe, who did that picture we saw earlier, sort of notes that it's puzzling and we don't really understand why it's happening, and he says, the cumulative effect of repetition may have been intended to give emphasis and significance to the composition, which is sort of fair enough, but as he says himself, is slightly unsatisfactory. And just one more comment, this is one that Rofe quotes, though it's not his opinion. It's from the 1950s, and it says, it is a curious feature of the sculptures of Persepolis, unencountered elsewhere, that every relief has to have a counterpart showing the opposite sides of the same figures. Was it some sort of frenzy of realism? Was it because in the world of Zoroastrian dualism, it was perhaps felt the unseen sides, being in the sort of darkness, were prey to evil? So basically the point is here that this is a characteristic of Persepolis which has often been commented on, which has attracted a lot of either bafflement or negative attention. But by seeing these reliefs as using these sort of decorative patterns and appealing to the gestalt sort of parts of your mind, this suggests a sort of positive and specifically Persepolitan reason for why these reliefs look the way that they do. I also think it has political effects, which I will come back to in a minute when I've just spoken about the Akropolis. Okay, so here it's less immediately apparent that the sculpture is decorative. Usually people compare the fluidity of the Akropolis with Persepolis. But close examination shows that there is a sort of decorative patterning going on here. For instance, here we have this linear progression of basic figures. There's a sort of degree of variation in the angles of the arms and the way the cloth folds, which is not like the kind of figures, but nevertheless there is definite patterning happening. And we can see the same thing happening even more clearly on here. This is the North Frieze, slab 6. And here again we can see these figures are sort of similar. They're all carrying their hijra. They've all got their arm up. There are also variations in what the other arm is doing, in how the cloth hangs. And of course this fourth figure at the end is doing something completely different. But nevertheless there's a sort of patterning, decorative quality going on. What's probably most interesting about this is the way in which the repetitions are done, though, which is very, very different from how it works at Persepolis. Instead of being these very precisely similar figures with a few factors that change, you can see that instead it's sort of very, very slight and variable differences from figure to figure, a much kind of looser texture, and a much sort of more relaxed experience of trying to see the repetitions and the differences between them. There are some figures, obviously, that have almost no repetition. I was looking for... okay, I think I didn't put in... Anyway, we all know on the Parthenon frieze there are some bits that aren't in line. There are some bits that are. And we can also see various other... sorry, that was what I was thinking of. Good. Sorry, I'm speeding up because I'm aware that we're quite short on time and I don't want to make you all wait for supper. There are various other sort of points on the site where you can see different types of repetition happening. Obviously the caryatids, this is symmetrical across the main axis, and a lot of similarities between the clothing and the hairstyles. Example of the Nika parapets doesn't really survive, but the general idea was there were about 100 Nika figures, or leading towards seated Athenas, so that's a sort of very high degree of possible repetition and variation. And this is just my point to make that the sort of interplay between the architectural features, between the triglyphs and the metapedes, sort of adds to the sense of patterning, that the way in which they play off against each other sort of takes the images from simply being images and makes them very much architectural elements of the buildings. From this we can see that there are very strong reasons to see the Akropolis sculpture as decorative. However, the application of its effects is very different at Persepolis. It's applied much more intermittently, and when it is used, the repetitions and reflections are not exact. There's almost no identical replication in the sculpture itself. You do occasionally get what's called lithography, where they seem to have done exactly the same face, but we'll pass over that. It's not a particularly common feature. But rather, it's very approximate repetition, overlaid by both minor and major variations. And as a result of this, there isn't the same compulsion to resolve the pattern or the sense of visual overload from being unable to do so. Instead, the effect of this looser kind of pattern is to invite selective comparison from figure to figure, in a kind of endless fluctuation reminiscent of Gombrich's concept of restlessness and repose. So we can see that on both sides, the way decoration is used binds the viewer even, to the site and to the buildings, but at Persepolis in a way that has a very strong controlling visual effects, whereas the Akropolis promotes a more sort of relaxed and selective participation from the viewer. And this is interesting not just aesthetically, but also in terms of social and political effects. Particularly firstly, in terms of their relationship to their empires. We previously mentioned, of course, that both of these sites are built directly after some kind of major imperial or however you like to define it, developments. But the differences between these empires, culturally, one of the very important ones, of course, is that the Athenian archaea is over other Greeks, people who have a basic Greek cultural point of reference. So the people who are going to be seeing the Akropolis are either Athenians themselves or they're people with a sort of Greek cultural understanding. So people who will be able to relate to sculpture potentially in sort of successfully, iconographically, and with cultural background. Whereas the Persian Empire is totally heterogeneous. It's made up of people who have no real grasp of Persian artistic agendas or conceptions at all. So it's very, very useful for them to be using a technique like Gestalt techniques that appeal to people's very innate response to art and response to visual stimulus, rather than something that requires some kind of cultural understanding. Secondly, the sort of slightly more both obvious and contentious possible way of looking at them politically is that the political systems of the two states are very different. Persepolis obviously is an autocracy, and Athens is a democracy of sorts, with much more emphasis on the direct engagement of individual citizens and their contribution to the affairs of the polis. There's an obvious consonance here between these distinctions and the different ways in which the sculpture used their decorative effects. The higher degree of order and control in the decoration of Persepolis creates an experience in which the concepts of a sort of highly defined, highly ordered society is perpetuated, whereas the experience at Athens gives a much greater degree of power to the viewer in their engagement with decoration. As I said, that's a slightly that's a quite contentious conclusion, and it's very important not to get into kind of essentializing the democratic, autocratic view of Persepolis and the Akropolis. Over the course of my PhD as a whole, I looked at the sites in various different ways, and if I could sort of build up for you the way in which the architecture works, and then the architectural sculpture, and then the style, and then the iconography, and then the sense of time, I hope I would be able to convince you more fully that this really is actually quite a persuasive reading of the sites, and particularly, because this is my main concern here, that it's very persuasive to read. A lot of Persepolis' choices, which have often been kind of dismissed or misunderstood as being very, very directly, not only politically orientated, but orientated towards a political audience who don't necessarily have the artistic skills and knowledge to unpack any sort of any more enculturated ideas, and that it also sort of plays around with hierarchies. But I have spoken for quite long enough, so I will be quiet now and wait your questions. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry I ran on.